Welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast. Many thanks for joining us on the Journal of Biophilic Design today. Just as a heads up, we have got the cities issue coming out for the Journal of Biophilic Design. We've also had home, healthcare and workplace. So if you've already bought a copy, thank you very much. You can also, if you enjoy the podcast, support us by buying us a coffee. Go to search on buymeacoffee.com and search for the Journal of Biophilic Design. We're really excited to be joined today by Karen McLennan. She's assistant professor in neurodiversity in the Department of Psychology at Durham University. Her research focuses on understanding how autistic people's sensory processing differences relate to their mental health and experiences of different environments, which is obviously really relevant to what we're doing here with Biophilic Design. She's co-producing research to support mental well-being and make environments more enabling for autistic individuals. But Karen, many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about biophilic design and many other things.
That's brilliant. Well, before we start, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what sort of took you on this journey? What got you interested in sort of finding a bit more about, autism and sort of sensory reactivity?
Yeah. Well, for me, I actually came to academia a bit later than others, and I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I was did a lot of creative stuff, and I did a performing arts diploma at college, and then was a bit not sure what I wanted to do, and thought that kind of science and maths and things were a bit beyond me, and then I got very personally interested just reading about psychology and stuff like that, and then decided to go to university as a mature student, which was an interesting experience, but very fun. And actually, as part of that, I did a placement with the Centre for Autism at the University of Reading. The people who work in that realm, really fascinating. Got really into that research area and did my dissertation on sensory experiences. And then the whole world of the whole realm of neurodiversity and everything kind of opened up for me. This kind of different sensory experiences across lots of different people, and really realizing kind of, because we all experience the sensory world, we're all taking in sensory input at all times, and that's how we interact with the world. And actually seeing and hearing experiences of how different people do that, I just still find really fascinating. And you can really apply that to yourself and notice kind of the things that you respond to in your environment, and actually see how that reflects in people who have differences in the way they process sensory information. So then I went all the way on, did a PhD, and here we are.
You must find it really interesting when you go somewhere. We got a bit off on piste with the script here, but you must find it really interesting when you go to different places, whether it's like a shopping mall or whether it's just a coffee shop. Just you must sort of find yourself looking at places and kind of thinking, this is really going to be annoying for people, and they could just have done this slightly different if they'd have only just done X. Do you find yourself doing that?
Absolutely, especially with the kind of more recent work I've been doing, and really it's made me much more heightened to considering when I'm in different environments, like even things when I'm like, I'm not enjoying this so much, and then I'm like, wow, actually for people who really struggle with sensory input or certain sensory environments, this must be really, really challenging, because actually I don't even want to be in here. So even though I can never put myself in the position of somebody who has that level of kind of struggle in certain environments, you can still kind of be aware, especially because I spend a lot of my job talking to different people and hearing their experiences. So I do definitely do that and comment on it a lot, as the realm of researchers I work in with, who all do kind of sensory stuff. We're constantly talking about like the sensory environment and sensory experiences and all of that. It's a bit of a thing.
We're going to sort of talk about different senses and that as we go along. I'm sure there's probably one sense that affects people more than others. There's probably one thing that kind of like gives people an overload. I think I might know what that is, but I'm going to ask you that as we go along. You speak and write about sensory reactivity. Can you explain a little bit about what that term means, please?
The kind of main distinction with using the term kind of reactivity is that I do focus a lot more on people's experiences and behaviors, and kind of my work looks at it from that area. So although I talk about sensory processing differences, that is more related to what's happening in the brain, which obviously is really challenging to study unless you're a neuroscientist, because we don't really know what's going on in the brain. But from looking at people's responses and kind of reactions to the sensory environment, to sensory input, we can make inferences about what might be going on in the brain. So it might be, so for example, I talk about sensory hyperreactivity, which is a term that refers to people who may react more strongly to sensory inputs. So they might experience sensory inputs such as sounds or touch or taste as kind of overwhelming or painful. So a kind of really almost negative response to sensory input. And from that, we can infer that actually that might be that there's something in their brain that is processing that information and that sensory information differently than kind of the general norm, is what we kind of talk about when I talk about things comparatively being different. So because I am not a neuroscientist, that's why I talk about things such as reactivity. But we can also see that people can be under responsive to sensory input as well. So they might not notice, again, sounds or something as much as others. And also another behavior that we can see in people who have sensory differences is sensory seeking. So people might become more fascinated or fixated by certain sensory input and may seek it out kind of more for longer periods of time and more repeatedly. So often that is involved with kind of more sensory enjoyment, but it can also be involved with some challenges if it's a negative input that somebody is struggling to disengage from, or is just generally struggling to disengage, and that can be distracting for kind of day-to-day life and stuff. So yeah, that's more the kind of area that I conduct my research in.
Okay, so how does it affect people with autism and sort of people who are neurodiverse? I mean, you kind of sort of touched on, how it refers in those instances.
Yeah, so we know that kind of a range of different people can have differences in their brain that mean that they process sensory information differently. And we know that this is kind of more common in autistic people. So estimates are, it kind of go up to around 94% of autistic people can experience sensory processing differences. And that doesn't mean that they get all three of those kinds of, types that I was referring to. It can be very individualistic. It could be very dependent on the person as to how they experience that. But because of that kind of really high prevalence of sensory processing differences in autistic people, it is part of the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum conditions now. But we also know that there are other populations who have differences in the way their brains process sensory information, such as people with ADHD. We also have links to anxiety, as well as PTSD and OCD also kind of link in with these kinds of different sensory experiences. We don't always know if this is to do with kind of actually there being differences in the way that people's brains actually process that information, or if it is to do with more kind of arousal levels that you get. So for example, somebody who's anxious tends to kind of be in flight or fight a lot of the time, so they might be more on guard to their environment and might overly process their environment in that way, and then might be more likely to react negatively to sensory input, for example. So there's still a lot we don't know kind of what's going on in the brains, but we do know that these reactions are present across lots of different populations. So yeah, it's not specific to autism. It just is very common in autistic people.
The issue that's kind of this is parallel to is our cities issue, and I've been very interested in how we can reduce sound and the cacophony in cities, for instance, because obviously that's one of the major I mean, obviously apart from like the fact that there's like loads of people and lots of noise and lots of just bodies and cars and sort of activity that's surrounding us all the time. What are the particular challenges that people with autism particularly, or people who are neurodiverse, have in these environments? Like if you're on public transport, or if you're in stadiums, or just outside spaces generally, what are you finding are the kind of main challenges that people are finding in cities generally?
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, that traditionally there's not been a huge amount of research that has looked at the effects of environments for autistic people. It's more kind of considering the individual factors. So our work is kind of in a very small realm that has started looking at this, which I hope keeps growing. But we know that there are, from our research, that autistic people told us that a lot of environments are really disabling for them. And so this isn't just, the fact that they, related to access needs, but actually they're finding that, they are being disabled by by a lot of environments because of sensory input. And as you said, like a lot of these places, public places such as public transport, supermarkets, restaurants, healthcare settings, places like that, they are innately quite heavily sensory burdensome environments. But also we found that although autistic people obviously told us a lot of different things about the sensory landscapes in those places that are really challenging, which feeds into a lot of research that we already know, and what autistic people tell us a lot to do with sounds, of there being a lot of sound, a lot of people, a lot of smells, lights, colors, all of this. They are quite heavy burdensome sensory environments. But actually there's a lot of other factors that they told us interact with that sensory environment that can actually make spaces more disabling. And actually some of the places they told us that they really enjoy going are places that do have really high sensory burden, such as stadiums, or live music events, or I mean, museums tend to be quieter, but kind of these still busy public places, and especially things like gigs and sporting events are loud, and there's a lot of stuff going on. But obviously some of that is because people are able to prepare and go and engage with things that really interest them. So there's, I really enjoy doing this, therefore I can handle this environment. But these other things that can kind of interact with the sensory environment, which actually is the stuff that we really can target, because some places, like a city centre, you don't have a lot of control over the sensory input. There are things you can do. So for lights, you can obviously build tree canopies, stuff like, or make sure there's tree canopy, etc., etc. But things like considering like the spatial design, so whether spaces feel really enclosed or really open, because more open spaces can be a lot more enabling because people aren't kind of getting funneled through. How predictable spaces are, so being able to kind of communicate ahead of time, when the busy periods are, or where you can find certain things, or for autistic people, being able to look ahead of time, know where the challenging sensory input is, know how busy it's going to be, know where everything is they need to go, means that they can prepare a little bit further in advance, and it's kind of reducing that added burden on them to be able to navigate the space. Also considering things like adjustments. So for autistic people, some might need or want to engage in environments without having to use spoken communication, without having to speak to people in those environments. So things like having self-checkouts and supermarkets takes away that added need if they are struggling to then have to speak to a person. So considering how that can apply to other environments is important. As well as understanding like pace needs. So if somebody's feeling overwhelmed and an autistic person's in a really loud, busy environment, they might need a bit longer to be able to navigate and to be able to achieve whatever they need to achieve, or if they're buying something or whatever that may be, just like allowing some space for somebody to process and to be able to take their time and get what they need. And also having kind of spaces where people can take a break and recover, because a lot of these spaces aren't built or have any thought for, they just want to get people in and out. So places like supermarkets, there's nowhere to take a break that's a little bit quieter, or to be able to have a moment just to kind of recoup, to be able to carry on in that environment. So that was something that was talked about a lot by our participants. And also the other thing is the kind of lack of understanding, more generally in the public, as well as with staff at certain places. People tend not to understand a lot about autism, as well as sensory challenges that people might be facing. And that can be really hard when somebody, for example, might, if an autistic person is experiencing kind of sensory overload, we call it, and that can sometimes look like a meltdown, but it can sometimes look like kind of a shutdown. So it might be that somebody is really, really struggling and they've reached their limit. And, ideally, we obviously want to make spaces where this doesn't happen. But presently, this is something that autistic people might experience. And, we are in situations where people tend to call security or call the police on people, rather than knowing what they're seeing and providing support. So, or judging people if they're using their own support strategies, such as stimming, which we might see in different motor behaviors, or kind of using fidget toys and things like that. People are still kind of really stigmatizing those sorts of things. Which means that autistic people maybe aren't accessing tools that they need to navigate these spaces. So all of these things are really important about, the sensory environment. So we need to consider all these other factors and different things that we can address in different environments, because whatever we can address, reducing the burden of those is really, really important, because then it means that even if you can't actually change the sensory environment itself, there are all these other things you can do that can make these spaces more enabling. So yeah, that's really kind of the main thing that our research has shown so far.
That's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I sometimes get myself, I get a bit overloaded when I'm in a supermarket, or it's just like there's the beeping, the lighting, all these factors, just just a bit too much sometimes. There's trolleys, and there's just sound and a load of metal stuff and reflective surfaces. So I was going to ask you, but I think sound is one of the biggest stressors. Is that one of the things that sort of comes up that a lot? Is it sound?
Yeah, so in a previous study I did, I wanted to find a little bit more about kind of the sensory input that autistic people find to be kind of the most challenging or enjoyable and things like that. And yes, sound was the most common one that people talked about, and that was to do with kind of like loud spaces and sudden kind of loudness and unexpected and unpredictable loudness, as well as places that do have kind of a lot of background noise. And as you described there, those kinds of experiences in the supermarket are the kinds of things that can really build into that. But I think from what autistic people have been describing, it is like all of that is screaming at you. Like it is like having that, but cranking the volume up to the point where, that they use those kinds of methods in torture in places. So, that is kind of the experience that is happening there. And obviously there's, a lot of autistic people I've spoken to do take strategies. So they listen to music to kind of control that sound input, or use ear defenders and things like that. So there are kind of self-driven strategies that can be done, but equally there's a lot of spaces where, it would just be a more pleasant environment if that kind of acoustic setting was considered a little bit more. But then there are a lot it will really depend on the individual, because there are some people who maybe don't find sound as bad, and there are visual inputs that will also be really challenging. So I think kind of globally it does seem that sound is a big challenge, but there are definitely a lot of complexities, and also we do experience all of this as an onslaught at all times when we're in those spaces. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I always find it quite remarkable when you are talking to like business owners or something, or you're talking to designers, and they say, yeah, they haven't even thought about sound. You know what I mean? The business, when they come to bring in like, oh, we want to bring in these like acoustic panels, we want to sort of muffle the sound, or we want to create, individual spaces, or like the Nook pods, kind of create places where people can go to, and they're going, well, what do we need that for? We've given them desks over there, and they're just only, it's going to cost money to put a thing up, and actually, well, you're not going to get the productivity out of your staff, and they're probably going to walk, even though they might be like amazing programmers or whatever it is that they're doing. So
yeah, that's the thing. It's the open plan office argument, where everybody thought it was a great idea for building connections and collaboration and getting the buzz. And I get, like, some people definitely love that buzz, and some people love having, being immersed in kind of noisy environments. But for the people who struggle with that, it is really, really disabling. And as you said, it can, really stop people from being able to access employment and, healthcare and services that they, essential services. So it's an issue.
So there's sort of visual complexity as well. I think that drives me nuts. I can't stand it if there's like little bits hanging around and envelopes that's half open and stuff, and it's just like, it freaks me out. I just got so much stuff going on in my mind anyway, and I just see like little bits and bobs everywhere. I just got to have, mostly in my immediate work environment. I mean, the rest of my house, I got like crazy load of books and knickknacks and stuff like that, but they all mean something to me. But in my workspace, I just need to have it kind of uniform, so they're all black books there. And I just sort of it's just a sensory overload. It's just a visual thing as well as that. So anyway, I want to sort of bring it back to biophilic design, because we all love biophilic design. In your sort of in your research and things and your findings, what are you seeing that biophilic design, how can we bring in biophilic design to support neurodiversity, wherever that may be?
So I think, again, it's one of those things that it's talked about a lot in kind of architectural built environment literature and that kind of research, whereas in psychology research, it's actually, there obviously is like nature, effects of well-being, those kinds of studies that we do, but there's very little that's actually looked at biophilic design in the environment and how that can affect people. So although the built environment literature is great, and it's amazing that there's stuff out there that's talking about how you can use that to benefit well-being, but also autistic people as well, a lot of it isn't kind of, there's the kind of experimental studies to kind of actually really look into that and say, okay, well, does it have does it improve? Like, does it help people? But we do know, obviously, the effects of kind of nature on well-being. So it is one of those that I think we need a bit more research to look into it a bit more. But like from our study, the kind of top enabling public space that autistic people talked about were outdoor spaces. So talking about parks, woodlands, beach, those kinds of places, and basically finding those to be enjoyable spaces. And there has been a bit of research that's looked at kind of the effects of nature for autistic people, especially in children, and kind of showing how it could be beneficial for development, so sensory motor development, emotional and social development, so it can kind of have these sorts of benefits, as well as kind of highlighting some of the challenges to kind of engaging in natural spaces, such as fears of kind of judgment, as well as there's still kind of elements of natural spaces that can induce anxiety, as well as kind of safety concerns as well. So there are kind of some barriers for that. But as I said, like bringing that into actually looking at if we're incorporating natural elements into design, looking at those effects in autistic people specifically hasn't been looked at, and we really need to look at that, because especially because of the sensory challenges that autistic people face, we need to make sure that whatever is being incorporated into environments and into built environments is beneficial. Because I think that kind of using natural elements, although I think that there's, based on kind of other work and kind of what we know and anecdotally, using elements of biophilic design would lend itself to making environments more enjoyable for autistic people, because of things like the color schemes tend, obviously, it aligns with our kind of innate processing, and we are better able to process nature and natural shapes and patterns a lot easier. So I think that if you kind of apply that to people who might have differences in sensory processing, incorporating design features that do play into that more easier kind of processing should be beneficial. And the fact that natural design tends to be using kind of these softer patterns and things like that. So I think that basically it should lend itself really nicely to supporting, as we know it does, it helps a lot of people anyway, that I think that the evidence would kind of support that it's beneficial for autistic people. And also the BSI design guide for neurodiversity, which recently came out, really focuses on kind of the sensory, how to make built environments more sensory inclusive. And they mention biophilic design quite a few times throughout that, and about how, you know, making more predictable sight lines and things like that, and how natural design and biophilic design does kind of feed into that. And yeah, so I feel like there's a lot of benefits that would have, even things like being able to incorporate, you know, we know that if there is more actual greenery and stuff in spaces, that is a kind of natural a dampener of sound, like it absorbs sound and stuff like that. So and our brains enjoy processing that kind of information, like looking at plants and things like that. And I did do some pilot work in autistic people, looking at preferences for looking at different visual, like videos and sounds, and as part of that I included nature stimuli, and they were rated as being very enjoyable for autistic people as well. So would like to do more work in that direction, but I've just done some pilot work for now. So yeah,
it's really good. I think we spoke before, you know, I think it was a couple of weeks ago about that, because obviously I'm generating these virtual nature walls, so which are sort of videoscapes with naturescapes and kind of Foley and stuff. So yeah, it'd be great to run pilot studies with you and just kind of see what happens, really see how we can make spaces better for people, you know, helping them fine tune it for themselves. I know David Koyman talks about that, doesn't he? About sort of like how you fine tune it for the individual. Like for his instance, his Nook pods, he can tune the lights, and people can tune the colours, and you know get it personally for them. I also like the fact they got fiddlesticks and stuff they can fit under the desk. You know, I think it's just so. I think it's just brilliant. I think they're really, really good. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, Karen?
Yeah, I guess the main thing that I kind of want to say when we're thinking about designing spaces, and you know, obviously I'm talking on behalf of my participants here as well, so I'm hoping I've represented them in a way that it is appropriate, but I think again this also came up in the BSI design guide and is really important to the work that I do, is that to make sure that we're doing and designing spaces and experiments and studies and whatever we're doing that are going to benefit autistic people, that they need to be involved in the process. And I think that that is a kind of key thing, is that we can do as much science and research as we want, but actually if we're not checking in and on a kind of case-by-case basis, making sure that what we're doing, what we're applying does actually suit the people who are going to engage with that space. And I think that's where I mean, we can apply that beyond just talking about autistic people. Like for example, if we are building a new school, and the design team should be talking to the people who are going to use that space, talking to the kids, talking to, is this great? Will this work for you? It does this, how is this going to benefit you? And the same, if you're building a care home, talk to people who would engage and use a care home and find out actually, is that a beneficial space for them? Because although we can say, oh, okay, well, we know this about autistic people, for example, we can take these elements and apply this to this space. It actually might not apply as well. We can use it as a good starting block, but actually being able to check in and be like, okay, well, is this space enjoyable? Will this work for you? I think that is the most important thing. And that is how we are now starting to do our research as well. More and more, like all of my research, I have kind of consultants who work on the project, or I collaborate with autistic researchers or whoever is kind of that, you know, it would be involved and is a stakeholder as part of that. To make sure that whatever we're producing does work for everybody, because I think that there's just been this kind of gung-ho approach to a lot of stuff where people think, oh, well, we're the, you know, we're architects, we're the experts, or we're, you know, the business owners, we're the experts, and actually like not realizing that a lot of the time we're producing end products that then people go, nope, don't like it. This does not work for me. And as I said, this is something that was really integrated in that BSI design guide for neurodiversity, saying that these are kind of our guidelines of what we think is important and what, you know, based on what we know, we can give you a general idea. However, importantly, they repeat over and over, do consult with the community to find out if this is actually, you know, going to work for them. So I think that is just something that I'm very passionate about in my research, and I think is really important for me to make sure that whatever I'm producing evidence-wise does also, you know, reflect kind of lived experience and incorporates voices within that, and amplifies voices who, you know, it's really going to actually benefit. And so, yeah, I think that should be applied to a lot of other situations as well, especially in the design context.
If you think about it, you employ different skill sets to do different parts of your business. And with those skill sets comes different personality types, as we all know. I mean, you know, the ocean model and all these other things. We know that everybody has a different type of personality that do different things. You know, people listening to this, probably half of our listeners, at least half of our listeners, are hopefully on that wavelength anyway. But the other half who might not have thought of that, just take a moment and think, yeah, actually, if I'm going to be employing different different skill sets within my business, they're probably going to have different personality types, and therefore they're probably going to want different things within the workplace in order for them to flourish, to be the best people they can be, to help well-being, to help keep them at work longer. You know, so they don't have more sick days, which is going to cost the business line, you know, because that's one of the things as well that when I'm discussing with people, they say, well, trying to get, for instance, biophilic design into the workplace, there's the economics of it. They say, oh, well, it's going to cost me, how much is it going to cost me to put those plants in, or how much is it going to cost me to put that circadian rhythm lighting in, you know, how much. But actually the bottom line is you're going to get a better output.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that like that is kind of a lot of why we do the research we do, is to go like, because a lot of my research is basically like, I know this thing about the world because people are telling me, but I'm going to put it into evidence, so then I can take it back to people and go, look, statistically this percentage of people really benefited from this, and in this way. So for example, showing if you use this type of, you know, if you incorporate biophilic design, this amount of people are going to work better and be happier, etc. And then people go, oh yeah, okay, you can't argue that because the economic cost. So I think like a lot of the work that I'm doing and others are doing is to kind of just bolster that kind of evidence to make sure these kinds of things happen, basically. And I think also kind of related to that, that when I was talking about expertise, and like you kind of, you know, touched on that with kind of getting these different personalities involved and stuff, is actually recognizing that everybody has expertise. And like, I think there's a kind of hierarchy where people go, well, I'm the expert and these people don't know anything. And actually, by working together and recognizing that everybody has expertise, even if it is lived experience, like, you know, especially when you are trying to co-design and collaborate and work out, and you know, we're sharing spaces, everybody who shares that space should be able to have some kind of input about how that space looks if you want to build a space that works for everybody. So I think being able to, you know, we all have our, you know, I can do statistics, great, that is my contribution, I can make this into a research paper. But like, you know, getting everybody else's experience within that, it's a really fun creative space to kind of be in. But if anybody is listening and does want to start getting community consultants involved, please pay them. Because that's one thing that I've seen cropping up a lot, is a lot of autistic people, for example, are being asked to give their lived experiences and to talk about, to review stuff for free. And I just wanted to add that if that is something that you're interested in doing, lived experience is still expertise, and they should be paid for their time still, even though, because you would pay a consultant, they are still consultants. It's just a different kind of expertise. So yeah.
Like that. Thank you. Before I ask you the final question, which I ask everybody on the podcast, just as a kind of to sum up really, before I ask the final one, why for you, why is nature connection important?
Oh, for me personally?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, honestly, I need it to survive. I feel like it is just essential for me. And I mean, I think it is for a lot of people. It's just whether you recognize that or not. And I really know that if I'm not engaging with natural environments and stuff like that, I can feel my well-being just plummeting. And so it's not, I know people go, oh, you should go out for a walk every day. For me, it's not just about that. It's about actually going and being in nature. And I really practice like mindfulness in nature as well. So I don't listen to audiobooks or music or whatever when I'm out and about in nature. I'll do that when I'm in cities. But I will pay so much attention to the smells and the sounds and what I can see and hear. And I really immerse myself in that. And I just find that I come back and I'm just like, I can breathe again. So yeah, for me, it's so essential to and it makes me more creative. I always find that if I've gone and spent some time by the beach, or especially the beach actually, or out in a forest, sometimes I do think about work. But even if I don't, I come back and I just feel rejuvenated and ready to it really gets my creativity flowing. So it's a very, very essential thing for me.
Well, that's great. So on that note then, if you could paint the world with a magic brush of biophilia, what would it look like?
Oh my God, it'd be green. It'd just be so much more green. Whenever I see these amazing concept designs of buildings that are just pouring with nature, and just, and seeing community projects where there's a concrete jungle that they have planted and put edible fruit, veg, things that the community can benefit from. And I just think anywhere like that, there's a space in Oosburn in Newcastle, so I've recently moved up here, and it's in the middle of the city, and it is just, there's a community farm, and there's these big bridges with trains and stuff going over, and then just a stream with all these trees just in the city. And I'm just, for me, that, more of that everywhere would just be, everyone would just be so much happier, I think.
Thank you for listening to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast.